Hello, my name is Eric Westrick. Today we're going to look over a case study. This is the investigation of an outbreak of E. coli O157 H7 linked to the contamination of leafy greens. Between August and December of 2020, the United States Food and Drug Administration and multiple state and federal agencies were investigating a multi-state outbreak of E. coli O157 H7 related to consumption of leafy greens. This presentation will outline the steps taken by federal agencies in the investigation of this outbreak. First, we have step 1. The outbreak was identified on October 28, 2020. There were 40 illnesses reported across 19 states. The hospitals reported the cases to the CDC. 20 of these cases required hospitalization. 4 developed hemolytic uremic syndrome. There were no deaths associated with this outbreak. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Food and Drug Administration worked together to gather illness data from the hospitals across the 19 states. Step 2. E. coli O157H7 is a bacteria found in the intestines of terrestrial animals. This E. coli bacteria produces Shiga toxin that causes a range of gastrointestinal illnesses, from watery diarrhea to hemorrhagic colitis. E. coli O157H7 induces enterohemorrhagic disease that can cause systemic illness by hemolytic uremic syndrome, which manifests as hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, and acute renal failure. HUS can result in both acute and potentially life-threatening illness and lifelong chronic illness. Supplies used: PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction, and whole genome sequencing, or WGS, analysis were performed on samples obtained from several sources. Investigators also used geographic analysis to create a picture that includes the cattle farming and grazing lands above the leafy green farms. Travel to the Salinas growing area of California was required to investigate this outbreak. Step 3. Investigators were able to identify the outbreak strain using PCR and WGS, or polymerase chain reaction and whole genome sequencing. Investigators were able to interview patients. 96% of ill persons interviewed, or 22 out of 23, reported yes or maybe to eating a variety of leafy greens. 21 yes, 1 maybe, in the week before their illness started. Compared to the 2006-2007 FoodNet population survey data, in which 71.3% of respondents reported eating leafy greens, the proportion of cases reporting eating any type of leafy greens in this outbreak was significantly higher than expected. Of the 23 people who were asked what type of leafy greens they ate, 16, or 70%, reported yes or maybe to eating spinach. 11 yes, 5 maybe, and 15, or 65%, reported yes or maybe to eating romaine lettuce. Most ill people reported eating a variety of leafy greens. The laboratory findings. The investigators found genetic similarities between the outbreak strain and the fall 2019 outbreak strain from a romaine lettuce E. coli O157H7 outbreak traced back to the Salinas growing area. There was also a connection to a sample obtained from a cattle gate on public land less than 2 miles upslope from a produce growing farm in the Salinas growing region of California. One cattle feces composite sample taken alongside a road approximately 1.3 miles upslope from a produce farm with multiple fields tied to the outbreak by traceback matched the outbreak strain of E. coli O157 H7 by WGS, or whole genome sequencing. In addition, several other samples tested positive for other strains of E. coli O157 H7, as well as other STEC serogroups, including the positive sample matching the outbreak strain of E. coli O157 H7. 38 tests of the over 800 conducted were reported positive for E. coli, including 2 for E. coli O157 H7. One matched the outbreak strain, one matched another previously identified strain. This most recent positive sample, matching the 2020 outbreak strain of E. coli O157 H7, was collected approximately 3 miles from a positive sample related to a 2019 outbreak of E. coli O157 H7 linked to the consumption of romaine lettuce. Of the 38 tests positive for E. coli, 36 tests were positive for STEC E. coli. 3 were soil samples, 2 were sediment, 24 were animal scat, 3 were environmental swabs, 1 was from leafy greens that did not get put into the supply chain, and 3 were from water samples collected using high volume dead end ultrafiltration. Steps 4 and 5. The case definition. For this outbreak, any person who becomes ill with gastrointestinal distress, diarrhea, and renal failure due to E. coli O157H7 after consuming leafy greens from the Salinas growing area of California should seek medical treatment. The outbreak strain isolated from the 40 cases identified was found in samples obtained from cattle grazing above the Salinas growing area in California in 2020. Steps 6, 7, and 8. The hypothesis. The hypothesis that investigators developed was that cattle were most likely the source of the outbreak strain of E. coli O157H7 associated with the 2019 and 2020 leafy greens outbreaks. This hypothesis is strengthened by the finding of the matching outbreak strain in a cattle feces composite sample taken alongside a road approximately 1.3 miles upslope from a produce farm, with multiple fields tied to the outbreak by the traceback investigation. The consistent recovery of outbreak strain in cattle feces demonstrates that these human pathogens are in environments which surround produce growing fields. These findings do not indicate the extent to which this and other E. coli O157H7 strains persist in growing environments, although it is not clear how E. coli is moving in the environment and causing outbreak events linked to leafy green fields. All 2020 on-site investigations noted that many of the farms with leafy green ranches fields identified by traceback investigation had adjacent or nearby cattle grazing and or adjacent uncultivated lands, which could serve as wildlife habitat during the production season. Also, evidence of animal activity was noted on hillsides of adjacent or nearby lands during the investigations. This hypothesis needs further refining. I believe studies in this area will help give a better picture of how the outbreak strain encountered the produce. Unfortunately, the investigators arrived in the Salinas growing area after harvest. The investigators were not able to observe planting, growing, and harvesting of the leafy greens. This data could help refine the hypothesis. Step 9. Control and prevention. The investigators make several control and prevention suggestions. They strongly encourage collaboration among various groups in the broader agricultural community, owners and leafy green growers, state and federal government agencies, and academia to address this issue. With this collaboration, the agricultural community, alongside the academic and government partners, can work to identify and implement measures to prevent contamination of leafy greens. The Food and Drug Administration recommends that growers of leafy greens in the California Central Coast growing region consider this particular strain of E. coli O157 a reasonably foreseeable hazard. Farms must take all measures reasonably necessary to identify and not harvest covered produce that is reasonably likely to be contaminated with a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard, and handle harvested covered produce during covered activities in a manner that protects against contamination with known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. When pathogens are identified through microbial surveys, pre-harvest or post-harvest testing of leafy greens, they recommend growers implement industry-led root cause analysis to determine how the contamination likely occurred, and then implement appropriate prevention and verification measures. They need to actively encourage it in locally led, locally convened effort called the California Agricultural Neighbors, or CAN, work group that is being led by the CDFA and the Monterey County Farm Bureau to identify what actions can be taken to reduce the risk of stack contamination of leafy greens in this specific growing region. They need to actively participate in the California longitudinal study to better understand the ecology of human pathogens in the growing region. This multi-year effort is intended to provide information on how human pathogens survive in the broader agricultural environment and how they move through the environment, leading to potential produce contamination prior to or at harvest. The results from this collaboration are intended to lead to improved practices to prevent or mitigate food safety risks and ultimately help enhance the safety of produce grown in the region. They need to actively encourage participation by adjacent and nearby livestock owners and other agricultural producers in the region to participate in the CALS as well. The FDA recommends that all producers of leafy greens be aware of and consider risks that may be posed by adjacent land use, especially as it relates to the presence of livestock and the interface between farmland, rangeland, and other agricultural areas. They need to emphasize efforts around of prevention and assess growing operations to ensure implementation of appropriate science and risk-based preventative measures, including applicable provisions of the SMA produce safety rule and good agricultural practices. They need to improve traceability, increase digitization. They need a standardization of traceability records along the entire leafy green farm to store continuum, which would expedite traceback and prevent further illness. This is important at not only the grower level, but critical for shippers, manufacturers, and retailers as well, to improve overall traceability throughout the supply chain. They need to improve industry-led provenance labeling. After the 2018 outbreak of E. coli associated with romaine lettuce growers led a change in labeling to identify growing region on packaged romaine lettuce. While better food traceability back to farms is the ultimate goal, as an interim measure, provenance labeling has been helpful in identifying during traceback investigations where potentially contaminated romaine was grown. Thus, industry should consider adoption of improved and expanded labeling to further protect consumers in the event of a product recall and minimize the amount of discarded product. They should conduct a root cause analysis when a foodborne pathogen is identified in the growing environment, in agricultural inputs, in raw agriculture commodities, and such. The FDA is calling upon livestock owners to consider implementing monitoring programs for human pathogenic E. coli, which could be used by owners to assess food safety risks and potentially implement controls at the operations. They encourage livestock owners to share the information gained through such programs with leafy green growers. The FDA believes this type of information sharing may better enable the leafy green industry to characterize hazards in or near their growing operations and implement necessary measures to limit contamination from this pathogen. All of these controls will be implemented by encouraging all producers involved. Step 10. Communication. The report for this outbreak has been shared with all producers involved with the outbreak strain. Farmers involved with the leafy greens and cattle have both been involved with the communications of the outbreak and hypothesis. These farmers were involved with the recommendations. It is important for all those involved with the farming activities in the salinas growing area of California to accept and implement the recommendations from the FDA. It is also important for consumers to properly wash hands and produce before consumption. They can also discard outer leaves to make sure that the lettuce that they consume is safe for consumption. Here are my references. Thank you.